The damage was catastrophic and relentless. Turrets were destroyed. Fires broke out. The superstructure was shredded. Men were killed by the hundreds as shells tore through the ship. The deck became a hell of fire and smoke and screaming metal. And yet the Bismarck did not sink. Not easily. Not quickly. This was the thing about her. Even as she was being destroyed, even as she was becoming a burning, shattered wreck, she refused to go down. Her armor, still intact in many places, kept the sea out even as the shells continued to fall. She was built to survive, and in a terrible, agonizing way, she was doing exactly that, just surviving what should have been unsurvivable while everyone aboard her died. By 9:31 in the morning, the Bismarck had stopped firing. Her guns were silent. She could no longer fight back, but she was still afloat. By 10:15, she was described as a burning wreck. Admiral Tovey, his ships running desperately low on fuel, turned for home. He ordered the heavy cruiser Dorsetshire to finish her off with torpedoes. Dorsetshire fired 2 torpedoes into the Bismarck's starboard side. Then she moved around and fired another into the port side. Whether these torpedoes were what finally sent the ship under, or whether it was the simultaneous scuttling actions taken by the surviving German crew below decks, is a question that historians have debated ever since. The answer is probably both. The British shells had wrecked her. The British torpedoes hastened the end. And the German sailors, in a final act of defiance and seamanship, opened the seacocks and detonated explosive charges to deny the British the prize of capturing the ship intact. At 10:39 in the morning on May 27, 1941, the Bismarck sank. She went stern first, then capsized and slid beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. Of her crew of approximately 2,200 men, only 110 survived. The rest, over 2,000 sailors, went down with her or were lost in the sea. A German U-boat and several surface ships nearby broke off their search for survivors when they believed, falsely as it turned out, that a British submarine had been sighted. Many men who might have been saved were left to drown or to die of exposure in the freezing Atlantic water. The sea does not discriminate. It simply takes. One of those 110 survivors was a junior gunnery officer named Burkhard von Mullenheim-Rechberg. He was the senior officer among those saved. He survived the war, became a diplomat, and eventually wrote a book about his experience titled Battleship Bismarck, A Survivor's Story. It remains one of the most remarkable first-hand accounts of naval warfare ever written, told from inside the ship as it was being destroyed. He described the sounds, the concussions, the smell, the darkness, the chaos. He described watching his shipmates die. He described finally going into the freezing Atlantic water and being pulled onto a British ship. His account gives a human face to the statistics of that day. Now, let us go back to that single torpedo, because the story of why it mattered so much is actually about design and physics and the specific, brutal mathematics of naval warfare. The Bismarck's designers had created a ship that was extraordinarily well protected. Her armor scheme was comprehensive. Her underwater protection was considered among the best of any capital ship of her era. The hull was divided into many watertight compartments, so that flooding in one area would not necessarily spread to others. Her belt armor, the vertical armor on her sides at the waterline, was extremely thick. Attempts to hit her from the side were unlikely to penetrate to her vital machinery spaces. But every ship has weak points. Every engineering solution creates a problem somewhere else. And the Bismarck's weakness was her steering gear. The rudder system of a large battleship is necessarily located in the stern of the ship, below the waterline, in an area that cannot be heavily armored without compromising the steering itself. The rudder posts, the shafts that connect the rudders to the steering engines inside the hull, must pass through the hull, and that passage point and the steering machinery compartment itself is one of the most difficult areas of a ship to protect adequately. Naval architects knew this. They did their best. The Bismarck steering gear was protected as well as the designers could manage. But the specific torpedo hit that night, striking in just the right place as the Bismarck was turning, jammed not just one rudder but effectively her entire ability to steer. The physical force of the explosion, combined with the position of the rudder at the moment of impact, wedged the mechanism in a way that could not be freed, not in a workshop, let alone in the middle of a North Atlantic gale. The crew tried. The damage control teams, those brave and skilled men whose job it was to keep the ship working under any conditions, tried everything they could think of. Divers went into the flooded, dark, freezing steering compartment to assess the damage. What they found was devastating. The rudder was physically jammed, the metal twisted and buckled, impossible to free with the tools and resources available. Even in a dockyard with a dry dock and every tool imaginable, it would have been an enormous task. In the middle of the North Atlantic at night in a storm under threat of attack, it was impossible. And so the Bismarck circled, and the British fleet closed in, and 2,000 men died. The crew of the Swordfish that made the fateful torpedo drop never knew, in the chaos of that night attack, exactly which of their weapons had done it. The anti-aircraft fire was intense, the visibility was poor, and the pilots and observers were concentrating on flying their aircraft and surviving the experience. It was only afterward, when the contact reports came in saying the Bismarck was circling uncontrollably, that it became clear something decisive had happened. All 15 Swordfish returned to Ark Royal. It was itself something close to a miracle. Some were damaged. 1 or 2 crash-landed on the deck. But not a single aircraft was shot down. Not one aircrew member was lost. The old stringbags had flown through the most intense anti-aircraft barrage in the history of naval aviation to that point and had come home. The story of Lieutenant Commander John Moffett is particularly worth telling. Moffett was one of the Swordfish pilots on that second attack wave. In later years, after the war, he claimed credit for the torpedo hit that jammed the Bismarck's rudder. Whether his specific aircraft dropped the Decisive torpedo has been debated by historians, as is the nature of such claims in the fog of war. But Moffett gave many interviews and wrote about the experience in detail. He described flying through the anti-aircraft fire, the sky alive with tracer rounds and shell bursts, and releasing his torpedo at the Bismarck's stern. He described the low-level approach, almost skimming the waves, so close to the water that the spray was hitting his aircraft. He described the tension of the approach, the release, and then the race to climb and turn away before the Bismarck's guns could find him. He lived into his 90s, this man who had helped seal the fate of the Bismarck, and in his later years he spoke movingly about the weight of what had happened. Yes, he was proud of what the Fleet Air Arm had accomplished. Yes, he understood the military necessity. But he also understood that the decision he made that evening, that one action, that one press of the torpedo release, had sent 2,000 men to the bottom of the Atlantic. That is a weight that does not easily lift. There is a broader historical picture here that is worth exploring, because the Bismarck story is not just about one ship and one torpedo. It is about a turning point in naval history that most people do not fully appreciate. Before the Second World War, the dominant view of naval power was the battleship. Big guns, thick armor, vast displacement. The battleship was the ultimate measure of a nation's naval strength. The bigger the battleships, the more of them you had, the more powerful your navy. This had been the orthodoxy since the age of the dreadnought, since the period before the First World War when Britain and Germany had engaged in a frantic naval arms race that had helped push the world toward that first catastrophic conflict. Aircraft carriers existed. Naval aviation existed. But in 1939 and 1940, most admirals on all sides still thought of aircraft as supplementary to the main battle line. You used aircraft to spot for your guns, to torpedo an enemy ship and slow it down so your battleships could finish the job. The idea that aircraft could be the dominant naval weapon, that a fleet of torpedo bombers could threaten any surface ship regardless of its size and armor, was still being argued about in naval academies and planning staffs. Taranto changed that. In November 1940, a small force of Swordfish from the carrier Illustrious had attacked the Italian battle fleet in the harbor of Taranto and disabled 3 battleships in a single night. It was the first time in history that carrier-based aircraft had decisively struck a fleet at anchor. The implications were enormous. The Japanese assistant naval attaché in Berlin, a man named Takashi Nato, visited Taranto after the attack to study what had happened. His observations fed directly into the planning for Pearl Harbor. Then the Bismarck confirmed it again, even more dramatically. Here was the biggest, most powerful, most heavily armored battleship afloat, the pride of the German Navy, sent to the bottom not by other battleships, though battleships administered the killing blow, but first and most decisively crippled by an obsolescent biplane flying at 90 miles an hour. The message was unmistakable. No matter how thick your armor, no matter how many guns you carried, no matter how fast you could steam, if you could not protect yourself from aerial attack, you were vulnerable. The era of the battleship as the dominant weapon of naval warfare was ending. The aircraft carrier was taking its place. Pearl Harbor confirmed it 6 months later, in December 1941. There, a fleet of Japanese carrier aircraft destroyed the American battleship fleet in a matter of hours. And the American response to Pearl Harbor was built around aircraft carriers, not battleships. The great carrier battles of the Pacific, Coral Sea, Midway, Philippine Sea were the decisive naval engagements of the war. The battleships were there, but they were escorts and shore bombardment vessels. The carriers were the queens of the ocean. The Bismarck, in a strange way, helped teach the world that lesson. There is also the human dimension of this story that deserves full attention, because history is not just about ships and weapons and strategy. It is about people. Consider the men who flew those swordfish. They were young. Most of them were in their early 20s. They had signed up for the Fleet Air Arm, the Naval Aviation Branch, and had been trained to fly and to navigate and to drop torpedoes. The training was intense, the life was dangerous, and the rewards were largely the internal rewards of skill and courage and duty. On the night of May 26, 1941, they flew into the darkness and the storm and the anti-aircraft fire of the most powerful German battleship afloat. They flew at 90 miles an hour, in open cockpits, in a gale. They had no way of knowing that their fire control systems would be confused by the swordfish's slowness. They had no way of knowing that all 15 would come home. They flew because they were asked to fly, because the situation was desperate, and because they were the only ones who could do it. That is not a small thing. That is not something to be reduced to statistics or strategy. Those are individual acts of courage, multiplied 15 times on one night in the North Atlantic. And consider the German sailors. 2,000 men who, through no fault of their own, were on the ship that history had selected for destruction. Many of them had joined the Kriegsmarine because they loved the sea, or because their families had naval traditions, or simply because it was a job in a Germany that had been economically devastated before the war. They were not all true believers in National Socialism. They were sailors. They maintained their ship, they did their jobs, they fought when ordered to fight. And most of them died. The survivors carried that experience for the rest of their lives. Burkhard von Mullenheim-Rechberg spent decades trying to understand and explain what had happened. Other survivors gave interviews, wrote memoirs, and in later years gathered at reunions to remember those who were lost. They spoke of friends who died, of moments of kindness and brutality, of the sound of shells hitting the ship, of the cold of the North Atlantic water, of the kindness of the British sailors who pulled them out of the sea. War is vast in its historical sweep and intimate in its human cost. The Bismarck contains both dimensions. The wreck of the Bismarck was found on June 8, 1989, by the oceanographer Robert Ballard, the same man who had found the Titanic just a few years earlier. She lies in about 15,000 feet of water, roughly 300 miles west of Brest, France. When the cameras went down to her, the images were haunting. She rests on a slope, broken but recognizable, the great gun turrets still in place, the superstructure collapsed, the hull encrusted with marine growth. In the years since Ballard's discovery, several other expeditions have visited the wreck and surveyed it in detail. One of the most interesting findings from the later survey expeditions was about the condition of the hull. The torpedo holes from the Dorsetshure's final attack were visible, but the detailed analysis of the hull suggested that the German crew's scuttling efforts had been highly effective, that the seacocks had been opened and charges detonated in a deliberate and systematic way. This has been central to the ongoing historical debate about whether the Bismarck was sunk by British action or by German hands. The British, for obvious reasons, prefer to say they sank her. The German survivors, for equally understandable reasons, preferred to say they scuttled her, that the British never sank the Bismarck, that the crew denied the British that satisfaction. The honest answer is probably that the sustained British gunfire had so damaged the ship that she would have sunk eventually regardless. The scuttling, the opening of the seacocks, the deliberate flooding, may have brought the end sooner. What is clear is that at least some of the crew, facing inevitable destruction, chose to take control of their ships and themselves, to deny the enemy the satisfaction of the kill. It was, in its way, an act of defiance from men who had nothing left except their dignity. The debate over who ultimately sank the Bismarck is, in some ways, beside the point. What matters, what endures, what history judges decisive, is that torpedo. That one hit from one swordfish on the rudder in the dark and the storm, on the evening of May 26, 1941, is what decided everything. Without that hit, the Bismarck would have steered away from her pursuers and reached the safety of Brest. The British battleships were too far away and too short on fuel to catch her without that hit. The Luftwaffe's protective umbrella was only hours away. With that hit, she was lost, circling, helpless, through the North Atlantic night, waiting for dawn and the guns. One torpedo, one rudder, one night, 2,000 men. That is the story of the Bismarck. But the story has another chapter, one that is often overlooked, and it comes just 9 months later, in February 1942. Remember Eugene Esmond, the commander of 825 Naval Air Squadron, who had led the first swordfish attack on the Bismarck from HMS Victorious? By February 1942, he had been decorated and promoted, but he was still flying swordfish. The Germans, in a brilliantly audacious operation called the Channel Dash, attempted to move the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the cruiser Prinz Eugen from Brest through the English Channel back to German ports. It was considered impossible. The English Channel, with all its surveillance, all its shore batteries, all its mines and patrol aircraft, was the last place a German fleet should attempt to sail in broad daylight. They did it anyway, and it nearly worked. The British response was chaotic and uncoordinated. Several attacks were mounted and failed. And then the call went out for the fleet air arm. Esmond led 6 swordfish, just 6, against the German fleet in the middle of the channel. There was almost no fighter cover. The German air umbrella over the fleet was overwhelming, with dozens of Luftwaffe fighters protecting the ships. It was not a mission. It was a sacrifice. Esmond led his tiny force in any way. All 6 swordfish were shot down. 13 of the 18 aircrew were killed. Esmond himself was killed. His body was found later in the sea, and he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor, for what was described as a suicidal attack pressed home with extraordinary gallantry. Only 5 survivors were pulled from the sea. The attack accomplished nothing in military terms. The German ships got through, but it remains one of the most extraordinary acts of collective courage in the history of British military aviation. An act that the Fleet Air Arm honors to this day. The swordfish that attacked the Bismarck and the swordfish that died in the Channel Dash were part of the same story. The story of a generation of young men who flew obsolescent aircraft into situations where survival was far from guaranteed, and who did it because the situation required it and because they had the kind of courage that does not announce itself but simply acts. The Bismarck story also raises broader questions about the nature of single events in history. We tend to think of history as driven by large forces, by economics, by ideology, by demographics, by the accumulated weight of decisions made over years and decades. And that is true. But history is also punctuated by moments where a single decision, a single shot, a single torpedo changes everything. If that torpedo had missed or hit the armored belt instead of the rudder, the Bismarck would almost certainly have reached France. She would have been repaired. She would have gone back out. She might have joined with the Tirpitz, her sister ship, for another operation. The convoys, already under terrible pressure from the U-boats, would have faced a surface threat as well. How many more ships would have been sunk? How many more lives lost? How much longer would the Battle of the Atlantic have lasted? We cannot know. History does not allow replays. What we know is that one torpedo found one rudder, and the course of the war at sea changed. The Bismarck has become one of the most studied, most written about, most filmed naval events of the Second World War. Books, documentaries, feature films, novels. There is something about the story that grips people and will not let them go. Perhaps it is the sheer drama of the chase. Perhaps it is the paradox of the mighty brought low by the humble. Perhaps it is the tragedy of the hood. Perhaps it is simply the scale of it, the vastness of the North Atlantic, the weight of 50,000 tons of steel, the human lives on both sides. The British hit song of 1960, simply called Sink the Bismarck, captured the public imagination in a way that suggests the story still resonated nearly 2 decades after the events. The 1960 film of the same name, though dramatized and somewhat simplified, brought the story to a new generation. And it has never really stopped being told, because it is one of those stories that contains within it something essential about war and courage and the randomness of fate. That rudder, 12 degrees to port, jammed, immovable, the difference between safety and destruction, between life and death for 2,000 men, between a ship that might have changed the war and a wreck on the floor of the North Atlantic. One torpedo, one hit, one biplane. The Bismarck was supposed to be unsinkable, and perhaps in a narrow mechanical sense she very nearly was. It took the combined firepower of 2 battleships and 2 heavy cruisers, plus the scuttling actions of her own crew, to actually put her under. The shells hit her hundreds of times and she absorbed them and floated and fought back. But she could not steer. And without the ability to steer, all of that armor and all of those guns and all of that power was irrelevant. She was a fortress that could not move, a gun emplacement that could not aim, a ship that could only circle in the dark while the dawn and the enemy closed in. The swordfish that dropped that torpedo was returned to HMS Ark Royal, refueled, probably repaired. It was a machine and it had done its job. The pilot who flew it, whoever dropped the Decisive torpedo, climbed out of the cockpit, reported to his commanding officer, and eventually went to sleep. On the morning of May 27th, those swordfish crews woke up and heard that the Bismarck had been sunk. Most of them probably felt relief more than triumph. They had survived. Their friends had survived. The mission was done. The Bismarck was gone. And in her going, she helped teach the world a lesson that had already been glimpsed at Taranto and would soon be blazoned across the sky at Pearl Harbor. The age of the big gun battleship was over. The age of the carrier had come. The torpedo bomber, the aircraft, the carrier, these were the weapons that would decide the naval war. The irony is almost too neat. The weapon that proved it, the weapon that demonstrated beyond any further argument that no battleship was safe from air attack, was the oldest, slowest, most antiquated aircraft in the entire Royal Navy's inventory. An open cockpit biplane with a maximum speed barely above 100 miles an hour. A museum piece that happened to be in the right place with the right weapon at the right moment. History has a sense of humor sometimes. A dark sense of humor, perhaps. But it tells its jokes in ways that are impossible to forget. The Bismarck rests in 15,000 feet of cold, dark Atlantic water. She will rest there forever. The men who went down with her rest there too. The Hood rests in the Denmark Strait, in even deeper water. And the men of 825 Squadron and the other swordfish squadrons of the Fleet Air Arm grew old, and remembered and passed on their stories. What remains is the story. The chase across the North Atlantic. The loss of the Hood and its 1,400 men. The desperate search across 31 hours. The decision to break radio silence that gave the British the bearing they needed. The old biplane that flew into the storm and the anti-aircraft fire and came back again. And the one torpedo that found the one vulnerable spot on the most powerful German warship afloat. One torpedo, one rudder, one night, and the world changed.